A boy jumped into the river to save a baby trapped in a submerged car. The next day, when a black car stopped at his doorstep, he feared what was to come. The rain had been relentless since the early hours of the morning. Louis stood by the window of the small wooden house, watching drops pound the earth, turning it to mud. His younger sister, Emma, sat by the corner of the room, drawing shapes on a piece of crumpled paper. Their father was outside, struggling with some tarp to cover the fishing equipment. Louis could hear him cursing under his breath. "Is it ever going to stop?" Emma asked without looking up, her voice carrying a hint of unease. Louis sighed. "I don't know," he said, his eyes fixed on the river that was just visible in the distance. The water level was rising. He could see it, the usual calm surface now churning, brown with mud. "But it doesn't look good." He turned to his sister. "Hey, go get Mom. Tell her we might need to move some things up the hill," Louis said, keeping his voice steady so as not to worry her. Emma nodded, quickly getting to her feet and running off. Louis took a deep breath and stepped outside. The rain soaked through his clothes almost instantly. The chill set in, making his teeth chatter, but he ignored it. He hurried to his father's side. "Papa, it's getting bad," Louis said. He grabbed one side of the tarp and helped his father secure it over the small stack of fishing nets. His father glanced at the river, his brow creased with worry. "We'll be fine, Louis," he said, his voice tight, though there was something in his eyes that told Louis his father wasn't so sure. "Just help your mom with whatever she needs." Louis nodded but hesitated. He looked at the water again, seeing it creeping up, swallowing the muddy banks bit by bit. The memories of that day years ago flashed in his mind. His brother, slipping, caught by the current. The shouts, the panic, the helplessness. Louis blinked it away, his heart pounding a bit faster. He turned back to the house where his mother was already moving things off the floor. Emma was at her side, her small hands grabbing a few clothes, trying to be useful. Louis spoke up, trying to bring some confidence into his voice. "Emma, help Mama. I'll take the heavier stuff." He picked up an old wooden chest, hoisting it onto his shoulder, feeling the weight dig into his collarbone. "Where are you taking that?" his mother asked, her tone sharp with worry. "Up the hill, just in case," Louis said, already moving. He didn't wait for her response. They knew, as much as they tried to deny it, that the river had the power to take everything. Louis trudged up the hill, his feet slipping in the wet grass. The rain pounded on his head, and the wind blew against him, making every step a struggle. He dropped the chest at the top of the incline, under the shelter of a tree, and looked back down at the village. Most of the neighbors were already out, moving their livestock, covering their few belongings with plastic, shouting instructions to each other over the sound of the downpour. There was an urgency in the air, the kind that made Louis' skin prickle. He took a deep breath and headed back down. He needed to make sure his family would be ready. Suddenly, over the rush of the river and the rain, he heard it. A sharp, desperate sound. A baby crying. Louis paused, trying to locate the source. The sound cut through everything else, high-pitched and scared. Louis squinted through the rain, towards the road that ran beside the river. He saw it. A car, half submerged in the water, caught on something. The windows were closed, but he could see movement. There was a baby inside. "Papa, there's a car!" Louis shouted, pointing towards the river. His father turned, his face pale as he followed Louis's arm. "What are you doing, Louis?" his father yelled as he watched his son sprint toward the riverbank. Louis didn't answer. He felt his heart in his throat, pounding as he ran. His feet slipped in the mud, but he kept going, every instinct in his body screaming at him to stop. The water was high, the current dangerous, but he couldn't ignore it. As he reached the edge, he could see the car better now, almost fully under. He saw a glimpse of a small face through the window, eyes wide, mouth open in a silent cry. "Help!" a voice called from behind him. Louis turned briefly and saw a woman on the bank, her arms outstretched, eyes filled with panic. She was trying to wade in, but the water was already up to her thighs, pushing her back. Louis didn't have time to think. He grabbed a rock from the shore, felt its weight in his hand, and plunged into the water. The cold hit him like a wall, knocking the breath out of his chest. He gasped, but forced himself to move, one arm in front of the other, feeling the current tug at him, trying to drag him under. He reached the car. His fingers slipped on the wet surface as he tried to get a grip. He could see the baby inside, still crying, her tiny fists hitting the window. Louis felt panic rise up inside him. He couldn't let this happen again. Not another life, taken by the river. Louis gripped the rock and smashed it against the window. Once, twice. The glass splintered, then shattered. Water rushed in, soaking the baby, who shrieked, her cries muffled by the sound of the river. Louis reached in, his hands shaking, and grabbed the baby, pulling her out of the car. She was tiny, barely bigger than his forearm. He held her close, shielding her from the water as best as he could while he turned, kicking towards the shore. The current was strong, pushing against him, making every movement feel like a battle. He forced himself to keep going, his arms burning, his legs aching. The sound of the water roared in his ears, but above it, he heard the woman's voice again, pleading, crying. "Please, please!" Louis's feet found the bottom and he pushed himself up, stumbling towards the shore. He reached the bank, collapsing onto the wet grass, the baby clutched against his chest. The woman was there, her hands grabbing for the baby, her voice a mix of sobs and prayers. Louis handed her over, his whole body trembling, his chest heaving with the effort to breathe. He lay back, feeling the cold rain on his face, his eyes staring up at the dark sky. People were shouting, running. His father was there, pulling him up by his arm, shaking him. "Louis, are you out of your mind?" his father yelled, his face a mix of anger and fear. "You could have drowned. You—" Louis just nodded, barely hearing his father. His eyes were fixed on the baby, now wrapped in her mother's arms, her cries slowly calming. He felt his heart rate start to slow, the adrenaline draining away, leaving him exhausted. He had done it. He had saved her. But as he looked at his father's face, the fear there, and as he heard the whispers among the villagers, he wondered if it was worth the risk. He had no answer, just the cold feeling settling in his bones and the distant roar of the river as it continued to rise. The next morning, the rain had slowed, but didn't stop. It was like the sky had exhausted itself but refused to let go entirely. Everything outside was soaked, heavy with water, and Louis could feel the chill seeping into their small wooden house. He sat by the door, staring out, replaying the events of yesterday over and over again. The cries of the baby, the way the water felt like it was trying to pull him under, the moment he'd seen the woman's face, the desperation in her eyes. It was all still there, sitting heavy in his chest. Emma, his sister, walked over and knelt beside him, nudging his shoulder. "You okay, Louis?" she asked, her voice small, barely louder than a whisper. Louis turned to look at her, managing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He ruffled her hair. "Yeah, I'm fine," he lied. His voice cracked a little, but Emma didn't notice. She was too young to see through those things. Their father was in the corner, sitting with a stiff back, looking out the window. He hadn't said much since Louis had come back home yesterday. Louis knew his father was angry. Angry that he'd taken a risk. Angry that he'd scared everyone. And maybe angry because it reminded him of what happened to Louis's older brother. Their mother was in the kitchen, clattering around with dishes, trying to keep herself busy. The silence between everyone was thick and uncomfortable. It weighed on Louis more than anything. He knew the storm wasn't just outside. It was in here too. Suddenly there was a knock on the door. It was hesitant, like someone wasn't sure if they should be bothering them. Louis's mother paused, looking at his father, who gave a small, barely perceptible nod. She set down the dish and walked to the door. Louis held his breath as she pulled it open. It was one of the neighbors, an older woman named Clara. She was holding a bundle of dry clothes in her arms, her expression guarded. "Is Louis here?" she asked, looking around the room. Louis stood up, swallowing hard. "I'm here," he said, stepping closer. Clara walked in, her eyes narrowing as she looked him over. "You did a brave thing, boy," she said, her voice surprisingly gentle. "Risky, but brave. The baby's mother, she wanted me to thank you. She can't leave her house now, but she's grateful." Louis nodded. He didn't know what to say. He glanced at his father, who still hadn't turned from the window. There was no change in his posture, no reaction. Clara continued, her eyes shifting between them. "There's talk in the village. Some people think it was foolish. But there are others, like that woman. They think you're a hero." The word hero hung in the air like an accusation. Louis didn't feel like a hero. He'd seen the baby afterward, pale, barely breathing. He'd heard people whispering about how she might not make it, how the river had taken its toll. Clara gave him a sad smile. She set the bundle of clothes on the table and left without another word, closing the door behind her softly. The room fell into silence again. Louis's father turned finally, his face unreadable. He looked at Louis, his eyes dark, tired. "Hero?" he said, his voice low, rough. He shook his head. "You should have thought about us first, Louis. About your sister, your mother. What would we have done if something happened to you?" Louis swallowed, the words cutting into him. He wanted to argue, to say that he couldn't just stand there and do nothing. But his father's gaze was too heavy, too filled with something Louis couldn't bear to see. Fear, grief, disappointment. Louis nodded slowly, dropping his eyes. "I'm sorry, Papa," he said. His voice barely came out, just above a whisper. His father sighed, rubbing a hand across his face. "Just don't do something like that again," he said, his voice breaking. "We can't lose you too." Louis nodded again, but inside, he felt the conflict brewing. He couldn't stand the thought of not helping when he had the chance. He had done what he thought was right, but now all he felt was the aftermath, a mix of doubt and guilt that weighed heavy on his chest. After that, Louis tried to keep himself busy. He helped his mother move the rest of the things up the hill. He played with Emma when she asked, but his mind kept drifting back to the river, to the car, to the baby. He couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, somehow, he'd done something wrong. That maybe, in trying to help, he'd only made things worse. Later in the afternoon, Louis heard whispers from some of the other kids who had come by to help clear the fields. They talked about the car, about how he had jumped into the water. Some admired him. Some called him stupid. But none of it mattered. Louis could only think about the baby. He had saved her, but was she okay? Would she be okay? His friend Thomas came up beside him, shoving his shoulder lightly. "Louis, everyone's talking about you, man. You jumped in like some kind of hero. I wish I had the guts," Thomas said, his eyes wide, filled with admiration. Louis shook his head. "It wasn't like that," he said. His voice was flat, tired. He didn't want to be called a hero. He just wanted to know if what he did had made any difference. Thomas frowned. "What's up with you? You saved a kid. Why do you look so sad about it?" Louis didn't answer. How could he explain it? The water had felt like it was trying to swallow him whole, and the look on the baby's face, that fear, it was still in his head. He couldn't shake it. "Just forget it, Thomas," Louis finally said, brushing past his friend. He needed to clear his head. Louis found himself wandering back towards the river. The water had receded a bit since yesterday, but it was still higher than normal, and the current was still strong. He stood at the edge, staring down at the murky water. His hands were clenched at his sides, the memory of how cold it had been still fresh. He could feel his heart start to race again, like it had that day when he lost his brother. Suddenly he heard footsteps behind him. He turned, expecting to see Thomas or maybe Emma, but it was his mother. She walked up slowly, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, her face lined with worry. "Louis," she said softly, stepping up beside him. She looked at the river, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Why did you come back here?" Louis shrugged, not really sure himself. "I don't know, Mama," he said. I can't stop thinking about it. About the baby. I'm scared I hurt her." His mother reached out, placing her hand on his arm. "You did what you could. It was brave, but these things, they're never simple. You can't control what happens afterward." Louis nodded, but it didn't bring him comfort. He still felt the weight of it, the uncertainty, the fear. His mother squeezed his arm gently, then let go. "Come back home, Louis. It's cold out here," she said. Louis turned to follow her, but he cast one last glance at the river, at the place that haunted his memories. He knew he couldn't avoid it forever. He just wished he knew if what he'd done had really mattered. As they walked back to their small house, Louis saw a car drive past, a black car, sleek, out of place in their small village. It slowed down in front of their house, then sped up again, disappearing around the corner. Louis's stomach twisted. He didn't know why, but something about it set him on edge. He watched it until it disappeared, a sense of dread settling in his chest. Something told him this wasn't over. Not yet. The next day, the sun peeked out, struggling to break through the thick layer of clouds. It wasn't much, but it was enough to bring people out of their houses, assessing the damage from the relentless rain. Louis stood outside, leaning against the wooden wall of their small home, eyes scanning the street. The events of the past 2 days felt like a blur, but every time he closed his eyes, he could still see the baby, still feel the water wrapping around him like a cold fist. Emma was playing near the edge of the yard, hopping from one dry patch of grass to another. She called out to Louis, but he was barely paying attention, his gaze fixed on the road. His mother stepped out, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Louis, I need you to help your father fix the shed," she called, her eyes tired, lines of worry still creasing her forehead. Louis nodded, pushing himself away from the wall, when he heard it, a car engine. He glanced up and saw the same black car from yesterday turning the corner and slowly coming down the road, towards their house. It rolled to a stop just a few yards away. Louis's mother tensed, her eyes narrowing as she watched the car. The door opened, and a man stepped out, dressed in a crisp shirt, his face set in a hard expression. He looked out of place among the simple wooden houses of the village. "Are you Louis?" the man asked, his voice carrying over the yard. His gaze was fixed on Louis, and there was something in his eyes that made Louis feel uneasy. Louis nodded, his throat suddenly dry. He swallowed hard, his mother stepping up beside him, her fingers brushing his arm protectively. The man walked over, his shoes crunching on the gravel. He stopped in front of Louis, looking him over. "You're the one who saved the baby from the river," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied Louis's face. "Yes, sir," Louis said, his voice barely more than a whisper. The man sighed, and for a moment Louis saw something shift in his expression, a mix of exhaustion and something else. The man turned slightly, nodding towards the car. "My wife, she wanted to thank you herself, but she's with our son now. He's in the hospital." Louis felt his stomach drop, his heart beginning to pound. Is he okay?" Louis asked, his voice shaky. The man's expression hardened. He shook his head. "We don't know yet. He was in that water too long. The doctors say there's a chance, but..." He trailed off, his jaw tightening, his eyes turning cold again. "You saved him, but he's still fighting." Louis felt the words hit him like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came. The man took a step closer, his eyes locking onto Louis. I don't know what's going to happen to my son, but I need you to understand something, he said, his voice low, almost a growl. I appreciate that you tried to help, but if he doesn't make it, I don't know how I'll live with it. Louis nodded, feeling a tightness in his chest, a burning sensation in his eyes. I'm sorry, he said, his voice cracking. I did everything I could. The man looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I hope that's true, he said. He turned, heading back to the car without another word. Louis watched him go, his heart pounding, his stomach twisted in knots. His mother touched his shoulder gently, her eyes filled with concern. Louis, come inside. It's cold, she said, her voice soft. Louis shook his head. He felt frozen in place, his eyes glued to the car as it drove away, the sound of the engine fading into the distance. He felt his father's presence before he saw him, turning slightly to see his father standing in the doorway, his face a mask of frustration and fear. Louis, what was that about? His father asked, his voice rough. Louis turned to face him fully, the words sticking in his throat. It was the baby's father. He said the baby's still in the hospital. They don't know if he's going to make it, Louis said, his voice breaking. His father's face tightened, and he took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. This is exactly what I was afraid of, Louis, he said, his voice rising. You put yourself in danger, and now we're stuck in the middle of something we can't control. Louis clenched his jaw, his hands balling into fists. I couldn't just stand there, Papa. I couldn't watch that baby drown. His father's eyes blazed, but he didn't say anything for a long moment. He just stared at Louis, his expression shifting from anger to something softer, something that looked like fear. Finally, he shook his head, turning away. You did what you thought was right, he said, his voice low. But sometimes doing the right thing isn't enough. Louis watched his father walk away, disappearing back into the house. His mother lingered, her eyes on Louis, a sadness there that made Louis's chest ache. She didn't say anything, just reached out and touched his arm, giving him a small nod before turning and following his father inside. Louis stood there for a long time, the wind biting at his skin, the chill sinking deep into his bones. He felt a hollowness in his chest, a sense of helplessness that he couldn't shake. He had done everything he could, but it still might not be enough. Emma ran up to him, her face bright, her eyes wide. Louis, are you okay? She asked, her voice filled with concern. Louis forced a smile, nodding. Yeah, I'm okay, Em. Just thinking, he said. He ruffled her hair, trying to push away the thoughts swirling in his head. Why don't we go inside? It's getting cold. Emma nodded, taking his hand, leading him back towards the house. Louis followed her, but his mind was still on the baby, on the black car, on the man's face. The coldness in his eyes, the weight of his words. Inside, the air was warm, the scent of something cooking filling the small space. His father was sitting at the table, staring at his hands. His mother was at the stove, her back to them, her shoulders tense. Louis walked over, sitting down across from his father. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They just sat there, the silence stretching out between them, heavy with everything they weren't saying. Finally, his father looked up, his eyes meeting Louis's. You did a brave thing, Louis, he said, his voice quiet. But you have to understand, we can't afford to lose you. Not now. Not ever. Louis nodded, the tightness in his chest loosening just a bit. I know, Papa. I'm sorry. His father sighed, reaching across the table, resting his hand on Louis's shoulder. Just promise me you'll be careful, he said. Louis nodded, his eyes stinging. I promise. His father gave him a small, tired smile. Good, he said. He looked at the window, the sky growing dark outside. We've got a lot to do. Let's just get through today. Louis nodded, glancing at his mother, who turned, giving him a soft smile, her eyes filled with understanding. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. They were still here, still together, and that was something. The rest of the evening passed slowly. The tension that had filled the house seemed to ease, replaced by a quiet understanding. Louis helped his father with the shed, then played a game with Emma, her laughter filling the room, making the darkness of the past few days feel a little less heavy. But that night, as he lay in bed, Louis couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, the image of the baby, pale and fragile, burned into his mind. He knew he had done everything he could, but it didn't make the weight of it any lighter. As he drifted off, his last thought was a silent prayer, a hope that the baby would pull through, that his actions had mattered. He wanted to believe it, even if a part of him still doubted. The next morning, the village was quieter than usual. The sun was hidden behind gray clouds, and a cold wind swept through the narrow streets, rustling the wet leaves. Louis woke up with a dull ache in his chest, the weight of everything he'd heard yesterday still hanging heavy on him. He got dressed in silence, pulling on his worn jeans and a faded shirt, before stepping outside to find his father already at work in the field. "Come help me with this, Louis," his father called, his tone lacking its usual warmth. Louis nodded, walking over to the cassava field. His father was digging, moving the soaked earth. The plants that had survived the flooding were still drooping, their leaves coated in mud. It was a grim sight, and Louis knew his father was trying not to show just how much it upset him. Louis picked up a hoe and began to work beside him, the two of them in silence. The only sounds were the steady scrape of the hoe against the ground, the rustle of the wind, and the distant gurgle of the river. Louis' father finally spoke, his voice low. "About yesterday, what that man said." He trailed off, pausing his work, his hands resting on the handle of his hoe. "I know it's not easy to hear that kind of thing, but you have to remember, Louis, people do desperate things when they're scared." Louis nodded, his gaze fixed on the dirt. "I understand, Papa," he said, though the words felt hollow. He wanted to understand, but the doubt was still there, gnawing at him. They worked in silence for another hour before the sound of children's laughter reached their ears. Louis looked up to see a group of kids running down the dirt road, their shoes splashing through puddles, their faces bright. One of the boys, Thomas, called out to Louis, waving his arms. "Hey, Louis! Come over here!" Thomas shouted, his grin wide. Louis glanced at his father, who gave a small nod. "Go on. We're done for now," his father said. Louis set down the hoe, dusting off his hands as he walked over to Thomas and the others. They were gathered by a large puddle near the edge of the village, some of them tossing pebbles into it, others splashing around. "What's going on?" Louis asked, forcing a smile. Thomas nudged him with his elbow. "Nothing much, hero. Just hanging out," Thomas said, grinning. The other kids turned to Louis, their eyes filled with curiosity. "Is it true you saved a baby?" one of the younger boys asked, his eyes wide. Louis nodded, swallowing. "Yeah, but it was just something I had to do," he said. Another boy snorted, his arms crossed over his chest. "I heard the baby's still in the hospital. Maybe you didn't save it after all." The words hit Louis like a punch. His face flushed, and he clenched his jaw, trying to keep his composure. Thomas shot the boy a glare. "Hey, don't say that. Louis did more than any of us would have done. He's brave." Louis shook his head. "No, it's okay, Thomas," he said. "He's not wrong." He looked at the ground, the doubt bubbling up again. The baby's face flashed in his mind, the small, scared expression, the coldness of her skin as he pulled her from the water. The other kids were quiet, watching him, unsure of what to say. Finally, Thomas broke the silence, his voice softer. "Louis, we all think you did the right thing. We're proud of you. Don't listen to anyone who says otherwise." Louis managed to smile, though it felt forced. "Thanks, Thomas," he said, his voice barely audible. The group of kids drifted apart after that, each of them returning to their homes or chores, until it was just Thomas and Louis left standing by the puddle. Thomas looked at Louis, his brow furrowed. "You're really messed up about this, aren't you?" Thomas asked, his voice quiet. Louis nodded. "Yeah, I don't know if I helped or made things worse. And if something happens to that baby, it's gonna be on me." Thomas put a hand on Louis' shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "You did what you could, man. That's more than most people would have done. You've got a good heart." Louis looked at his friend, his eyes stinging. He wanted to believe Thomas, but it was hard. He nodded, though, not wanting to drag his friend into his doubts. "Thanks, Thomas," he said again, this time with a little more strength in his voice. As the day dragged on, Louis found himself drifting towards the river again. The water had calmed slightly, the current not as strong as it had been. He stood on the bank, staring at the place where he had seen the car, where he had jumped in. The memory of that moment played in his head, the cold water, the fear, the baby's cries. He closed his eyes, trying to push it away, but it wouldn't leave him. Suddenly he heard someone approach. He turned to see his mother, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her eyes filled with worry. "Louis," she said softly, stepping up beside him. She looked at the river, her lips pressed together. "I've been looking for you. You shouldn't be out here alone." Louis shrugged, looking back at the water. I needed to see it again. I can't stop thinking about it, Mama." His mother sighed, her face softening. She reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "Louis, you did what you could. Sometimes that's all we can do. The rest, it's not in our hands." Louis nodded, though it didn't make him feel any better. He knew she was right, but it didn't take away the fear, the guilt. His mother squeezed his arm gently, then let go. "Come on, let's go back home," she said. "It's getting late, and your father needs help with the shed." Louis nodded, turning to follow her. They walked back in silence, the village quiet around them. As they approached their home, Louis saw something that made him pause. Parked a little way down the road was the same black car, the one from before. His mother noticed too, her eyes narrowing. "Stay here, Louis," she said, her voice tense. She walked over to the car, her shoulders squared. The window rolled down, and Louis could see the man from before, the baby's father. His face was pale, his eyes dark with exhaustion. He spoke quietly to Louis's mother, his gaze flicking over to where Louis was standing. Louis's mother nodded, then turned, motioning for Louis to come over. Louis hesitated, his heart pounding before he slowly walked over, his stomach twisting in knots. The man looked at him, his expression unreadable. "The doctors say there's been some improvement," he said, his voice rough. "They think he might pull through." Louis felt a rush of relief, his knees going weak. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. That's good news," he said, his voice trembling. The man nodded, his face softening slightly. "I don't know if it was your doing or just luck, but either way, thank you." Louis swallowed, the weight on his chest loosening just a bit. "I'm glad," he said. "I'm really glad." The man looked at him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. He rolled up the window and drove away, leaving Louis and his mother standing there in the fading light. His mother turned to him, her eyes filled with tears. She reached out, pulling Louis into a hug, holding him tightly. "You did good, Louis," she whispered. "You did good." Louis closed his eyes, leaning into his mother's embrace, the tension in his chest slowly easing. For the first time since that day, he felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay. The black car lingered in Louis's mind, even after the man drove away and the news of the baby's improvement had settled into a corner of his thoughts. He couldn't shake the image of that car. It had felt like an omen, a reminder that whatever he'd done, right or wrong, was still far from over. The following morning, Louis woke up before dawn, the house still dark and cold. He crept out of bed, careful not to wake his sister Emma, and tiptoed into the main room where his father was just getting ready for the day. "Louis," his father said, surprised to see him. "You're up early." Louis nodded, rubbing his eyes. "I couldn't sleep. I thought I'd help you get started today." His father studied him for a moment before nodding. "All right then, let's get to work." They walked out to the cassava field in the dark, the air cold against their skin. Louis could see his breath in front of him as they worked, and the rhythmic scrape of their tools filled the silence. Louis's father didn't say much, and Louis knew he was trying to give him space, trying not to bring up the car or the man. But the silence was heavy, and eventually, Louis couldn't take it anymore. "Papa," Louis started, pausing his work, Do you think I made things worse?" His father leaned on his hoe, looking at Louis with tired eyes. He let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "Louis, I don't know. I can't answer that for you. But what I do know is that you did something most wouldn't have had the courage to do. That's got to count for something." Louis nodded, though it didn't give him the reassurance he was hoping for. He went back to work, the questions still buzzing in his head. They worked until the sun was fully up, the warmth starting to melt away the morning chill. As they returned to the house, Louis saw the black car again, parked down the road, its sleek frame almost glistening in the sunlight. "He's back," Louis whispered, his heart pounding in his chest. His father looked up, his face tightening. He dropped the hoe on the ground and walked ahead, his strides long and determined. Louis followed, his stomach twisting in knots. He watched as the car door opened, and the man stepped out, his face looking more tired than before. Louis's father stopped a few feet away, crossing his arms over his chest. "What do you want now?" he asked, his voice rough. The man looked at Louis, his gaze lingering before he turned to Louis's father. "I came to talk to your son," he said, his voice even, almost emotionless. Louis's father shook his head, his eyes narrowing. "He said everything he needed to say. You got your thanks in, and now it's time for you to leave." The man ignored him, his eyes meeting Louis's. "I need you to understand something," he said, his voice tight. "My son, he's still not out of the woods. He's still weak, and they don't know if there's been any permanent damage. And I can't help but think about that day, about how it could have gone differently." Louis took a deep breath, stepping closer. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice trembling. "I did what I thought was right. I swear I tried to help him." The man's eyes were hard, filled with something that made Louis feel small, like a child who had done something wrong without knowing why. "And maybe you did," the man said, "but maybe you also hurt him. You took a risk, and we're the ones paying for it." Louis felt his throat tighten, his eyes stinging. His father stepped forward, his face filled with anger. "You need to leave now," he said, his voice rising. "My boy did what no one else would have done. He saved your son." The man shook his head, turning to leave. "Maybe," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Or maybe he just tried." He got back in the car, the door slamming shut, and drove away without another word. Louis stood there, his hands shaking, his chest tight. He felt his father's hand on his shoulder, gripping it tightly. "Don't listen to him, Louis," his father said, his voice rough. "You did good, you saved that baby. That's all that matters." Louis nodded, though the words didn't settle in his heart the way he wanted them to. He looked at his father, the lines in his face deepened by worry, and felt a rush of emotion. He wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that what he'd done was right, that it had all been worth it. Later that day, Louis tried to go about his usual routine, but the weight of the conversation lingered over him like a dark cloud. He helped his mother cook, his hands moving automatically as she spoke to him, her voice soft, trying to distract him. Emma ran around the yard laughing and playing, her joy and innocence that Louis envied. It wasn't until evening that the full weight of it hit him. He sat alone in the small yard, staring at the setting sun. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, the beauty of it a stark contrast to the turmoil inside of him. He replayed the man's words over and over again, the doubt, the blame. Louis closed his eyes, the image of the baby flashing in his mind. He remembered her cries, the coldness of her skin when he pulled her from the car, the way her mother's face had looked when he handed her over. He felt the tears prick at his eyes, and he swallowed hard, trying to push it all away. But it stayed, lingering, a weight that he couldn't seem to shake. His mother came out then, her eyes filled with concern as she walked over to him, sitting down beside him. She didn't say anything at first, just reached out, resting her hand on his knee. "Louis," she said softly, her voice gentle. "I know you're hurting, and I know it doesn't feel like it now, but you did something good. You saved that baby." Louis shook his head, his eyes stinging. "But what if I didn't save him, Mama? What if he doesn't make it?" His mother sighed, her eyes softening. She reached out, brushing a hand through his hair, her touch comforting. "Sometimes we do everything we can, and it still doesn't feel like enough. But you did something brave. You risked your life to save another. That's all anyone can ask of you." Louis swallowed, nodding. He wanted to believe her, wanted to let go of the fear and doubt. He leaned into his mother's side, closing his eyes, feeling her arm wrap around him, holding him close. They sat there for a long time, the sun dipping below the horizon, the sky growing dark. The wind picked up and his mother gave him a gentle nudge. "Come inside, Louis. It's getting cold." Louis stood, his legs shaky, following her back inside. The warmth of the house surrounded him, the sound of Emma's laughter echoing from the other room. His father was at the table, his face tired but soft when he looked up at Louis, giving him a small nod. Louis sat down, and for the first time in days, he felt a small sense of peace. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. He had his family, and they were still here, still together. He knew he still had a long way to go, that the fear and doubt wouldn't just disappear, but he also knew he wasn't alone. And that, at least, was something. The morning sunlight spilled in through the small gaps in the wooden walls, casting long beams across the room. Louis woke to the sound of Emma giggling outside, the chirping of birds mingling with the muffled voices of his parents. He sat up, rubbing his eyes. The memory of the man's visit still fresh, the uneasy tension from the previous days lingered in his bones. He knew there was one thing he had to do: face what had happened head on, no matter how hard it was. "Today's the day," Louis whispered to himself, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He was going to visit the hospital, even if it scared him. As he got up, his mother peeked her head into the room. She offered him a soft smile, though her eyes still held that worry. "Morning, Louis. Breakfast's ready. Come on before your father eats it all," she said, trying to lighten the mood. Louis nodded, managing a faint smile. He got dressed and joined his family at the table, the room filled with the smell of fresh bread and porridge. His father was already eating. A newspaper unfolded in front of him, his eyes darting over the pages. Louis picked at his food, the knot in his stomach tightening. He looked up at his mother, her eyes meeting his, and she seemed to know what he was about to say before he even said it. "Mama," Louis began, his voice quiet. "I want to go to the hospital. I need to see the baby." His mother set her spoon down, her eyes softening. She looked at Louis's father, who paused, his face unreadable. "Louis, you don't have to—" his father started, but Louis shook his head. "I have to," Louis interrupted. "I need to see him. I need to know if he's okay. Please." His father sighed, rubbing his temples. "If that's what you need to do, then go. But take your mother with you. I don't want you going alone." Louis nodded, relief washing over him. He looked at his mother, who gave him a small smile. "All right then," she said, standing. "Let's get ready." The journey to the hospital felt long and daunting. The bus ride was bumpy, the air thick with the scent of damp clothes and dust. Louis sat by the window, his eyes fixed on the passing scenery, the green fields blurring into gray buildings as they approached the town. His mother sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm, a quiet comfort in the otherwise heavy silence. When they arrived, Louis felt his heart pounding in his chest, the large hospital building looming before them. He took a deep breath, following his mother through the front entrance, the scent of antiseptic filling his nose, the cold air conditioning brushing against his skin. The hallways were bustling, nurses, doctors, patients moving past them, voices echoing off the sterile white walls. Louis hesitated at the reception desk, his throat dry. His mother spoke for him, asking about the baby, giving the name of the parents. The nurse at the desk nodded, pointing them towards the pediatric ward. Louis felt his stomach twist as they walked down the hallway, his eyes scanning the room numbers until they found the right one. He stopped at the door, staring at it, the fear bubbling up inside him. What if the baby was worse? What if seeing him made everything more real? His mother placed a hand on his back, her touch warm, grounding him. "Louis," she said softly, "it's all right. You're here now. Just take a breath." Louis nodded, taking a deep breath. He pushed the door open slowly, his heart hammering in his chest. Inside, the room was quiet. The baby was lying in a crib, tubes attached to his small arms, his chest rising and falling gently. Beside the crib, the baby's father sat in a chair, his head bowed, his eyes closed. He looked up when the door opened, his eyes widening slightly as he saw Louis and his mother. "What are you doing here?" the man asked, his voice hoarse, tired. Louis swallowed, stepping forward. I needed to see him," Louis said, his voice trembling. "I needed to know if he's all right." The man stared at him for a long moment, then sighed, nodding. He looked back at his son, his eyes softening. "He's stable," the man said. "The doctors say he's doing better, but it's still going to be a while." Louis felt a wave of relief, his legs feeling weak. He took a step closer, looking at the baby, his small face pale but peaceful. "I'm glad," Louis whispered. "I'm really glad." The man watched Louis, his expression softening slightly. "You know," he said quietly, "when I first saw you, I was angry. I blamed you. But the truth is, you saved him. Maybe it wasn't perfect, but you did what no one else could do." Louis looked up at the man, his eyes stinging. "I just wanted to help," he said, his voice breaking. "I didn't want anything bad to happen." The man nodded, his gaze meeting Louis'. "I know," he said, "and I'm grateful. Truly." Louis' mother stepped forward then, placing a small stuffed toy, a worn little bear, on the edge of the crib. It was something Louis had brought from home, something he'd had since he was a baby. He hadn't known what else to bring, but it felt right. The man looked at the toy, then at Louis, his eyes softening even more. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet. "It means a lot." Louis nodded, his chest feeling lighter. He looked at the baby again, his small chest rising and falling steadily. He wasn't out of the woods, but he was alive. And that was enough for now. They stayed for a few more minutes, talking quietly, the tension between Louis and the man easing with each word. There was no more blame, no more anger, just a shared hope that the baby would get better. As they left the hospital, Louis felt a sense of calm he hadn't felt in days. The knot in his chest had loosened, and for the first time since the rescue, he felt like he could breathe again. His mother smiled at him as they walked down the steps of the hospital. "You did good, Louis," she said, her voice gentle. "You faced it. You were brave." Louis nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Thanks, Mama," he said. I think I can finally let go of some of it now." They took the bus back to the village, the sun shining through the windows, warming Louis's face. He closed his eyes, resting his head against the window, the sound of the bus rumbling beneath him a comforting white noise. His mother's hand rested on his arm, a steady presence beside him. When they got back home, Louis felt different. The village looked the same, the muddy roads, the small houses, the familiar faces of neighbors going about their day. But something had shifted inside him. He felt lighter, the weight of the fear and guilt no longer as heavy. He had faced what he needed to face, and though the journey wasn't over, he knew he could keep moving forward. Emma ran up to him as soon as they got off the bus, her face bright with excitement. "Louis, did you go see the baby?" she asked, her eyes wide. Louis nodded, smiling at her. "Yeah, I did, Em. He's doing better." Emma's eyes lit up, and she grabbed his hand, pulling him towards the house. "Come on, I want to hear all about it." Louis laughed, letting her drag him along, his mother following behind them, her smile warm. As they reached the house, Louis looked back at the road, the memory of the black car fading into the distance. He knew there would still be challenges ahead, there always were, but he felt ready to face them. For the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful, and that, he realized, was enough. The sun had settled high above the village when Louis finally felt the tension of the past few days ease up, just slightly. The small wooden house looked just as worn and tired as ever, but as he stepped inside, it felt different. Warmer, maybe. He wasn't sure if it was the sunlight filtering through the cracks in the walls, or if it was something inside of him that had changed, but either way, the weight on his shoulders was lighter now. Emma clung to his hand, her eyes sparkling as she pulled him towards the kitchen table. Their mother was already there, setting down plates with a smile. The familiar smell of cassava filled the air, and Louis's stomach grumbled, the day's events leaving him hungrier than usual. Tell me, Emma chirped, her excitement barely contained. She sat down at the table, her eyes wide and fixed on her brother. "What happened at the hospital, Louis? Did you see the baby? Was he okay?" Louis smiled, his heart warming at his sister's enthusiasm. He took a seat beside her, his mother sitting across from them, watching with that gentle, knowing expression. "Yeah, I saw him," Louis said, nodding. He paused for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "He looked small, Em. But he's doing better. He's still got a long way to go, but he's fighting." Emma's eyes widened and she grinned. "So, he's gonna be okay?" Louis looked at his mother, and she gave him a small nod, her lips curving into a soft smile. "Yeah, Emma. He's going to be okay," Louis said, his voice steady. It felt good to say it aloud, to believe in it, even if he wasn't completely sure. Their father entered the room just then, his heavy footsteps echoing against the wooden floor. He paused at the door, his gaze falling on Louis, studying him for a moment. Louis felt the familiar nerves, the fear of disappointing his father, but his father just nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "How did it go, Louis?" his father asked, his voice quieter than usual. Louis took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of his family around him, their eyes filled with hope. "It went well, Papa. The baby's doing better." The father, he was thankful. It felt right to go. His father nodded again, the tension in his shoulders easing as he walked over to the table, taking a seat beside their mother. He reached out, patting Louis's arm lightly. "I'm glad you went, son. I know it wasn't easy." Louis looked at his father, seeing the tired lines in his face, the worry that had been there for days now softening. He smiled, nodding. "Thanks, Papa." His mother clapped her hands, her voice lightening the room. "All right, enough serious talk. Let's eat before everything gets cold." They all dug in, the meal simple but comforting. Emma chattered on, her voice filling the room with a brightness that made Louis's chest swell with a warmth he hadn't felt in days. The weight of what had happened still lingered in the corners of his mind, but it was no longer crushing him. He knew there were no guarantees, but he also knew he had done what he could. After lunch, Louis decided to head outside. The sun was shining now, the sky a bright, cloudless blue. He walked through the yard, his eyes wandering towards the riverbank. The water looked calm, almost peaceful, glistening in the sunlight. He knew he couldn't avoid it forever, that he had to face it too, just like he had faced the hospital. He started walking towards it, his steps slow, deliberate. The closer he got, the more his chest tightened. The memory of the flood, of the car sinking into the water, of the baby's cries, everything rushed back to him, making his heart pound. He stopped at the edge of the bank, his toes just inches away from the water. He took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on the water. It was just a river, just a body of water. But to Louis, it was so much more. It was fear. It was loss. It was his brother's face, his mother's tears. It was the baby's cry, the coldness of the water, the weight of it all trying to pull him under. He clenched his fists at his sides, his jaw tightening. He had faced the hospital, faced the father, and now it was time to face this too. He stepped closer, his feet sinking into the mud at the river's edge. The water lapped at his shoes, cold, but not unwelcoming. "Louis?" He turned, startled, to see Emma standing a few feet away, her small figure silhouetted against the bright sun. She looked worried, her eyes darting between him and the river. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice small. Louis nodded, his eyes shifting back to the water. "Yeah, Em, I'm okay," he said. He looked back at her, smiling. "I just needed to see it again. I needed to not be afraid." Emma walked over, slipping her small hand into his. She looked up at him, her expression serious. "I'm not afraid of it, Louis, not when you're here." Louis's heart tightened and he looked down at his sister, her innocent eyes full of trust. He felt his throat tighten and he crouched down, pulling her into a hug. "Thanks, Em," he whispered, his voice cracking. "That means a lot." Emma hugged him back tightly, her arms around his neck. "You're the bravest person I know," she said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. Louis closed his eyes, holding her close. He didn't feel brave, but maybe that was okay. Maybe being brave wasn't about not being scared. It was about facing the fear anyway, about standing at the edge and not letting it push you back. After a while they pulled away, and Louis took Emma's hand, leading her away from the river, back towards the house. They walked in silence, the sun warming their backs, the sound of the river fading into the distance. When they reached the yard, they saw their father standing by the shed, his hands on his hips, a frown on his face. Louis could see that something was bothering him. His eyes narrowed at the sky. "Papa," Louis called, his voice hesitant. His father turned, his expression clearing when he saw them. He motioned for them to come over, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Louis, Emma, I could use some help with this old shed door. It's sticking again." Louis nodded, letting go of Emma's hand and jogging over to his father. He grabbed the edge of the shed door, pulling on it, feeling the old wood groan under his hands. His father stood beside him, pushing from the other side, their combined efforts finally getting the door to budge. "There," his father said, grinning at Louis. "You've got stronger arms than me now, huh?" Louis laughed, shaking his head. "I doubt it, Papa." They worked together on the shed for a while, Emma sitting nearby, drawing shapes in the dirt with a stick. The air was filled with the scent of fresh-cut grass and the warmth of the sun, the tension of the past days slowly fading away. It felt almost normal again, like the weight of what had happened was finally lifting, even if just a little. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. Louis leaned against the shed, looking out at the village. The neighbors were moving about, tending to their chores, their voices carrying in the warm evening air. It was quiet, peaceful, and for the first time in what felt like a long time, Louis felt like he belonged here again, like he was part of this life, this place. His father walked over, his hand resting on Louis's shoulder. "You did good, son," he said, his voice low, just for Louis to hear. "I know it's been tough, but you're stronger than you know." Louis looked at his father, his eyes stinging, and nodded. "Thanks, Papa," he said, his voice soft. He looked at the village, the houses, the people he knew. He saw the river calm and steady in the distance. I think I'm ready to keep going now." His father smiled, squeezing his shoulder. "That's all we can do, Louis. Just keep going." Louis smiled back, a warmth spreading through his chest. He knew the journey wasn't over, that there would still be days when the fear and doubt would return, but he also knew he had his family, his village, and himself. And that was enough. The morning was brisk, the air cool as Louis walked toward the riverbank. He had thought about this moment for days now, since that afternoon at the hospital. He wanted to confront his fears head on, to be here not because he had to be, but because he chose to be. The river was calm today, sunlight glistening off its surface. The rush of water was softer, almost a gentle whisper compared to the roaring, deadly torrent it had been that day. Emma wanted to come along, but Louis had asked her to stay home. This was something he needed to do on his own. He stopped at the bank, the muddy edge firm under his feet, and let out a slow, shaky breath. He felt the wind in his hair, the sun warming his skin, and he listened to the water. It was strange, standing here again. The river had taken so much from him, his brother, his sense of safety, and for a while, his belief in himself. Louis closed his eyes, the images of the past flooding his mind. His brother's laughter, the sound of his mother's sobs after the accident, the fear in his father's eyes when Louis had returned home soaking wet after saving the baby, the doubt that he might have made a terrible mistake. He opened his eyes, staring at the water. It wasn't about being fearless, he realized. It was about being willing to face it, about not letting it control him anymore. He crouched down, scooping up a handful of the cool river water and letting it trickle through his fingers, watching it fall back to where it came from. He didn't know if the river would ever stop being a source of both pain and fear for him, but maybe that was okay. Maybe it didn't have to change. Maybe he just had to learn to be okay with it, to coexist with it. Suddenly, Louis heard footsteps on the grass behind him. He turned to see his father, approaching slowly, his hands in his pockets. Louis straightened, a mix of surprise and something close to embarrassment rising in his chest. "Papa?" Louis asked, blinking. "What are you doing here?" His father smiled, but it was a small, tight-lipped kind of smile. He looked past Louis, at the river, his eyes thoughtful. "Your mother said you came out here," he said. He paused, his gaze meeting Louis'. "I thought I might find you here. Thought maybe you'd want some company." Louis hesitated, then nodded. He turned back to the river, and his father came to stand beside him, the two of them looking out at the gentle flow. The silence stretched on, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy, sure, but it felt more like an understanding. "I know what this place means to you, Louis," his father said finally, his voice low, carrying over the sound of the river. "I know what it took to come here today." Louis swallowed, his throat tight. He nodded, his eyes still fixed on the water. "I had to see it, Papa," he said. "I had to face it." His father was quiet for a moment. Then he reached out, resting a hand on Louis' shoulder. "I'm proud of you," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "More than you'll ever know." Louis looked at his father, his eyes stinging. The words sunk in, wrapping around the pain he'd carried for so long. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. His father squeezed his shoulder, then let go, turning his gaze back to the river. "You know, I used to hate this place," he said, his voice softer now. "After what happened to your brother, I couldn't stand the sight of it. I used to come out here just to scream at it, like it would make a difference." Louis looked at his father, his chest tightening. He had never known that. He had never imagined his father, always so steady and strong, standing here and letting out his pain like that. It made his father feel more real somehow, more human. "I think I understand that now," Louis said quietly, his eyes shifting back to the water. His father nodded, a sad smile on his face. "Yeah, but you know, it's not the river's fault. It's just doing what rivers do. It's dangerous, sure, but it's not evil. It's not out to get us." Louis let those words sink in. He looked at the water, at the sunlight glinting off the surface, at the way it flowed. Steady, unstoppable. His father was right. It wasn't about anger, about blaming. It was about accepting what was, about knowing that some things were beyond control. "I think I'm ready to make peace with it," Louis said, his voice quiet but sure. "Maybe not all at once, but slowly." His father smiled, nodding. "That's all you can do, son. Just take it one day at a time." They stood there for a while longer, neither of them speaking. The wind rustled the leaves of the nearby trees, the sound mingling with the gentle rush of the river. Louis felt a calm settle over him, a sense of closure or something close to it. His father finally turned, nodding towards the village. "Come on," he said. "Let's head back. Your mother's probably worried." Louis smiled, following his father as they walked away from the river. He looked back once just for a moment and felt the tightness in his chest loosen. He knew he'd be back here again, that he'd need to keep facing it, but for now, this was enough. When they reached the house, Emma was waiting on the steps, her eyes wide with curiosity. She jumped up when she saw them, running over, her voice excited. "Did you go to the river, Louis? Were you scared?" Louis smiled, shaking his head. "Not as much as before, Em," he said. "Not anymore." Emma grinned, taking his hand. "Good. I knew you'd be okay." They spent the rest of the afternoon working in the fields, the sun warming their backs as they moved through the rows of cassava plants. Louis worked beside his father, their movements almost synchronized, a quiet rhythm to their work. Emma played nearby, her laughter drifting over to them, a reminder of the joy that was still there, even in the midst of everything else. By evening, they were all exhausted, their muscles aching from the day's labor. They sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the sky turning brilliant shades of orange and pink. Louis leaned back, his eyes on the sky, feeling a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in a long time. His mother came out, a plate of bread and cheese in her hands. She set it down on the table in front of them, her eyes lingering on Louis. She reached out, brushing a hand through his hair, her touch gentle. "You're stronger than you think, Louis," she said softly. Louis looked up at her, smiling. "Thanks, Mama," he said. "I think I'm starting to believe that." His father nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "We're all stronger together," he said, his voice steady. Louis looked at his family, the people who had been there through it all, the fear, the doubt, the pain. They had stood by him, supported him, even when he wasn't sure of himself. And now, as they sat there, watching the last rays of sunlight fade, he felt that strength in them, in himself. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would still be days when the fear crept back in, when the memories of the river, of that day, would come rushing back. But he also knew that he didn't have to face it alone. He had his family, his village, and a new sense of understanding. And that, he realized, was enough. The morning sun filled the small kitchen with warmth as Louis sat at the table, Emma's giggles drifting through the air like a breeze. His mother was by the stove, humming softly to herself as she stirred something, her movements calm and steady. Louis felt the warmth of the sun on his skin, and for the first time in what felt like weeks, he felt truly at ease. Emma was sitting across from him, her small fingers busy with a few broken crayons, coloring on a torn piece of paper. She looked up at Louis, her eyes bright. "Louis, look, it's the river," she said, holding up her drawing. The river was just a wavy blue line, with a small figure standing beside it, stick legs, with a circle for a head. Louis smiled, reaching out to ruffle her hair. "That's really good, Em," he said. "Is that supposed to be me?" Emma nodded, her smile widening. "Yup, you're the bravest, you know." Louis felt his chest tighten at her words. He wanted to believe her, wanted to hold on to that version of himself that Emma saw, the version that faced his fears and protected the people he cared about. He took a deep breath, nodding. "Thanks, Em," he said softly. His mother turned from the stove, her eyes meeting his, filled with warmth. "We're lucky to have you, Louis," she said, her voice gentle. "We all are." Louis looked at her, his eyes stinging. He nodded, not trusting his voice to speak. He knew he had come a long way, but he also knew that his family had been the ones to carry him through, to give him the strength he needed when he couldn't find it on his own. The door opened then, and his father stepped inside, brushing dust from his sleeves. "Morning, everyone," he said, his voice light, a smile tugging at his lips. "Papa!" Emma called, jumping up from her chair and running over to hug him. Their father laughed, scooping her up and spinning her around, her laughter echoing through the kitchen. Louis watched them, a smile on his face, his heart swelling with warmth. His father set Emma down, ruffling her hair before looking at Louis, his eyes softening. "Louis, I need your help in the field again today. We're trying to get the new rows planted before the rain comes back," his father said. Louis nodded, standing. "Of course, Papa," he said. The day passed in a blur of hard work and sweat. Louis worked beside his father, their movements steady, planting the cassava row by row. The sun was bright above them, the warmth soaking into their skin, the familiar ache settling into Louis's shoulders. But it was a good kind of ache, the kind that made him feel alive, that made him feel connected to this place and to the people around him. When the sun began to dip below the horizon, they stopped to rest, leaning on their tools, their breaths coming out in heavy puffs. Louis looked at his father, who was staring out at the village, his gaze thoughtful. "You know, Louis," his father said, his voice quiet, "I was wrong. When I told you not to jump in that river, I was afraid that I would lose you too. But what you did, it was brave. And it showed me something. It showed me that sometimes the right thing is the hardest thing, and I'm proud of you for doing it." Louis looked at his father, the words sinking in, filling the empty places in his heart. He nodded, his voice thick. "Thank you, Papa," he said. His father smiled, reaching out to pat his shoulder. "Come on, let's head back. I think your mother has something special cooked up tonight." As they walked back towards the house, the sky turning deep shades of orange and pink, Louis felt a sense of peace settle over him. The village was alive around him, people moving about, voices carrying in the warm evening air, children playing in the distance. It felt right, like he was part of something bigger, something meaningful. When they reached the house, the door was open, the scent of something sweet drifting out, filling the air. Louis stepped inside, Emma running to greet them, her face bright with excitement. "Louis! Papa! Mama made your favorite, sweet bread," Emma said, her voice filled with joy. Louis smiled, glancing at his mother, who stood by the table, her hands dusted with flour, a proud smile on her face. "I thought we all deserved a little treat," she said, her eyes meeting Louis's. Louis felt his heart swell, warmth spreading through his chest. "Thank you, Mama," he said, his voice soft. They sat down together, the table crowded with food, simple but more than enough. His mother set a loaf of sweet bread in the center, and Emma's eyes lit up, her small hands reaching for a piece. Louis laughed, grabbing a piece for himself, the warmth of it filling his hands, the sweet scent making his mouth water. As they ate, the conversation flowed, light and easy, filled with laughter and stories. Louis listened to Emma talk about her day, about the games she had played, her excitement infectious. His father added his own stories, his voice steady and warm, his eyes softening when he looked at Louis. It was a small moment, but it was everything to Louis. It was warmth. It was love. It was the feeling of belonging that he had craved. He knew that the fears would come back, that there would be days when the river would haunt him, when the memories of that day would pull at him. But he also knew that he had his family, and that he had the strength to face it, one day at a time. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the room filled with the golden light of dusk, Louis leaned back in his chair, his heart filled with gratitude. The past few weeks had been a test of his courage, of his strength, of his ability to face the fears that had haunted him for so long. And as he looked at his family, their faces bright with laughter, he knew that he had passed that test. Not because he had been fearless, but because he had been willing to face his fears. His mother reached across the table, her hand resting on his, her eyes meeting his. "We're proud of you, Louis," she said, her voice soft. "We always will be." Louis felt his throat tighten and he nodded, his eyes stinging. He looked at his father, who smiled, his eyes filled with warmth, and then at Emma, whose face was sticky with honey, her laughter filling the room. He knew that this wasn't the end of the journey, that there would still be days when he doubted himself, when the memories of the river would creep back in. But he also knew that he had grown, that he had found a strength within himself that he didn't know was there. And with his family by his side, he knew that he could face whatever lay ahead. As the night settled over the village, the sky filled with stars, Louis stepped outside, the cool air brushing against his skin. He looked up at the sky, the stars twinkling above, and took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs. He felt the weight of the past weeks lift from his shoulders, replaced by something lighter, something that felt like hope. He knew that the river would always be there, that it would always hold a place in his memories, both good and bad. But he also knew that he had faced it, that he had stood at its edge and refused to let it control him. And that, he realized, was enough. He turned, looking back at the house, the warm glow of the light spilling out from the windows, the sound of his family's laughter drifting through the air. He smiled, stepping back inside, ready to face whatever came next. And as he closed the door behind him, he knew that no matter what lay ahead, he would keep moving forward, because he was stronger now, and he was not alone.